My regards, friends. Welcome to my channel. I am Alexander Musienko. Today is Saturday, May 31st, the last day of spring 2025. We are entering summer, and accordingly, we can say that both by natural conditions and officially, we are moving into the summer campaign, both directly at the front and, I don't know how else to put it, into some sort of summer negotiation Istanbul campaign. We'll see what comes of it. I'm skeptical, but let's wait for June 2nd and the further process because there have been statements about this. Now let's discuss them together. So the Kremlin has announced that the Russian delegation will come to Istanbul for negotiations where they will present their memorandum. The press secretary of the Russian dictator Putin, Peskov, stated that the Russian delegation will be in Istanbul on Monday morning. So already on Monday, yes, Monday. At first they agreed on, right, it really is Monday, June 2nd. Sorry, I got a bit mixed up with the calendar, please forgive me. So on June 2nd, Monday morning, the delegation will be in Istanbul for peace talks with Ukraine and will present their memorandum. Here's what Peskov said. Of course, no one is going to make anything public. This cannot be made public. Both draft memorandums, the Russian and the Ukrainian ones, will hopefully be discussed at the second round of negotiations, for which the Russian delegation will be ready on Monday morning in Istanbul. So there is a clear hint that there are already two significant draft memorandums which will be brought to Istanbul on June 2nd, and it is these important documents that will be discussed. Well, General Keith Kellogg, Trump's special representative on Ukraine, noted that representatives from the US, Germany, the UK, and France will be present at the negotiations in Istanbul. This is good for us, provided that they all play on our side. I hope so. Or at the very least, not to side with Putin and not to try to push Ukraine into concessions, capitulation, or giving up, surrendering something. Because we need to understand here that we've already gone through different stages, including those that implied Ukraine should make concessions. But taking into account the current trends and considering that Europeans visited Kiev on May 10th, and that ongoing consultations are constantly happening within the Ukraine, Poland, France, Germany formats, with Britain and Italy joining in as well. This is not being done for no reason. It is being done to strengthen European security, to find a joint solution to put pressure on Putin. Well, whatever the case may be, yes, the 17th package of sanctions adopted by the European Council and the European Union against Russia is far from perfect, and they are already preparing the 18th one. But nevertheless, they did it. The United States of America has not done this yet because Trump once again is waiting for decisions from Putin, even though he said and reproached Putin that the US had hoped for progress in the peace process, but Putin started launching missiles. And that this is very, very disappointing to Trump. Well, you could say that this week the enemy has reduced the intensity of Shahed drone attacks, although they are still flying. This is really either because Putin no longer wants to irritate Trump as much, perhaps, or maybe simply because they are running low and need to reload. I have two theories, and we'll see which one is right in the near future. But as you can see, Russia is acting cunningly in the meantime. That is, they haven't stopped, and they're carrying out more targeted attacks. Zaporizhzhia, Kharkiv, just in the past day. So they're somewhat shifting the focus of their attacks, but the attacks themselves are not stopping. This is exactly the peculiarity, the way the enemy generally operates. Although we can see that the enemy hasn't used large numbers of cruise missiles, calibers, or ballistic missiles for several days now, perhaps this is a demonstration of certain gestures, acts, and so on. Well, but is it worth expecting progress in Istanbul? I don't think so. We'll see what happens during this meeting. Even Hakan Fidan, even the Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is usually extremely diplomatic and reserved, noted after his visits to Moscow and Kiev that if Putin and Russia do not show flexibility on the issue of a ceasefire and the peace process in Istanbul, then they may face not very positive consequences for themselves. He, Fidan, did not specify what he meant. But even Turkey, even he is now making such statements. This means that Putin has pushed everyone to their limits, and now everyone is waiting for decisions from him, first and foremost regarding the ceasefire. Well, as Keith Kellogg notes in an interview with ABC News, advisors from Europe will join the negotiations in Istanbul with the Ukrainian and American delegations. According to him, this very group previously participated in drafting the Ukrainian version of the memorandum with 22 points during meetings in London and Paris. However, Kellogg names the absence of a Russian version of the so-called memorandum as an obstacle to holding the negotiations. When President Trump spoke with Putin, the latter said that he would hand over his memorandum within a week, but we still haven't seen it. The Ukrainians haven't seen it either. I asked the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Yermak, whether he had seen it. He replied that he hadn't. I also spoke with the chief Ukrainian negotiator, Rustem Umerov, who will be leading the talks in Istanbul next week. He hasn't seen it either. Well, there you have it. This is clearly a deliberate tactic to drag out the process. And do you know why or how this might look? The Russian delegation will indeed be in Istanbul on June 2nd. They will arrive and make statements to the media. They will try to hold a meeting, and the purpose of this meeting will be to hand over a draft memorandum for the Ukrainian colleagues to review. That's roughly how it will go. How does our enemy view this? As usual, Russia acts with the aim of manipulation and dragging out the negotiation process, which they constantly do, and we can see it. Well, these are the kinds of actions they take. So, in fact, this is what's happening and what we should expect. Should we expect any progress in terms of a ceasefire? Well, the issue is that Russia links these questions to completely different matters. Once again, Nebenzia, Russia's permanent representative to the UN Security Council, spoke out. Listen, of course, you have to take what he says with a grain of salt, divide it by 3, by 5, by 7. He was saying, this was Nebenzia speaking just a few hours before Easter, that there are absolutely no reasons for a ceasefire in Ukraine. And literally a few hours later, Putin announces that he is declaring an Easter truce, a Paschal ceasefire, so he does something completely opposite to what Nebenzia was relaying in New York. Well, that's just how it is. In other words, he says something, but that doesn't mean it has any decisive significance. But what Nebenzia did say was that he confirmed the viewpoint from our enemy's side, which we've heard before, that in order for the fighting to stop, Ukraine must stop receiving weapons from the West, halt mobilization, stop preparing for defense, and so on. Well, that's absolute nonsense. It's absolutely clear that these are demands no one will ever accept. But now he's already started voicing them. So this is just to give you an idea of how far apart the sides still are. And even if these draft memorandums are presented, we perfectly understand that once again, things will be put down on paper that currently do not align between Ukraine and Russia. In other words, this process will continue to drag on and be postponed. Although, again, Putin, no matter what, despite his obsession with war and aggression, it seems he is preparing some kind of backup plan for himself. What do I mean by that? Through Peskov, he is sending signals that he would be ready to meet with Zelensky, but only if, well, obviously some progress is made in Istanbul, but before this, he completely ruled it out. Previously, it was said that the Kiev authorities were illegitimate, that it was impossible to hold elections, and so on and so forth. And now Putin is saying and allowing, well, not Putin himself, but Peskov, though he conveys what Putin wants, and he allows for and does not rule out the possibility that such a meeting could eventually take place. An interesting turn of events, wouldn't you agree? I think he's preparing a backup option in case there really is a major blow with sanctions and the Americans strike hard. Although sanctions are, let's say, just one of the accompanying factors, but not the decisive one. I would put it this way. It simply makes everything more expensive for Russia and eats away at the National Wealth Fund. That's what's important about sanctions. In other words, they are spending more and more and using up their reserves, which they had been preparing and accumulating for years from selling Russian oil and gas faster and more actively. But this is not a cure-all. Next, there will be numbers, there will be data. You'll understand why, in fact. Meanwhile, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, noted that he met with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey, Hakan Fidan. He thanked Turkey and President Erdogan for supporting efforts toward a just peace, in particular for their help in organizing the meeting after which it was possible to free 1,000 of our people from Russian captivity. The return of all Ukrainians held by Russia is one of the main priorities, of repatriation. We discussed our diplomatic efforts and those of our partners. Russia ignores all calls for a ceasefire and continues the killings. Moreover, for more than a week now, the Russians have been unable to present the so-called memorandum they promised to prepare. Ukraine has not received any documents, Turkey as well. For the meeting not to be pointless, it is necessary to understand its agenda and properly prepare for the negotiations. Unfortunately, Russia is doing everything to ensure that the next possible meeting is fruitless. Well, we understand this perfectly because Russia will bring the memorandum. I think they will bring a draft memorandum and show it. Well, in the morning of June 2nd, they will arrive, and not before noon on June 2nd will they be ready to present it right at the negotiations, so that, like a bolt from the blue, in order to shock everyone, at least that's what they think, and in this way try to buy themselves some more time. Why? Because the Ukrainian, US and European delegations will say that they need to consult and then make a decision regarding this memorandum. Well, these things seem obvious to me. Meanwhile, Hakan Fidan, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, stated that Turkey is proposing to hold a meeting between the leaders of the US, Russia and Ukraine in order to bring an end to the war in Ukraine closer, following potential second-round talks in Istanbul. In other words, the second round of talks in Istanbul would serve as a precursor and preparatory forum before a meeting at the highest level. It turns out that's the case. At least that's how it's being interpreted in Turkey. But this isn't the first time we've heard this. Peskov has stated that a meeting is possible, as I've already mentioned. The president of Ukraine has said he's ready. Trump has also indicated that he's ready. Only Putin remains silent. So this topic is being discussed, and it's possible that during his visit to Turkey, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan also raised this issue with the Russians. So here's what Fidan says. He says that in Turkey's view, negotiations involving the three leaders as well as Turkish President Erdogan could take place after potential second-round talks between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul, which might happen next week. We sincerely welcome the possibility that the first and second rounds of talks in Istanbul could be concluded with a meeting between Mr. Trump, Putin, and Mr. Zelensky under the leadership of Mr. Erdogan. Progress is possible if we remain at the negotiating table. Well, that's the point of view. You see, yes, it has a right to exist, but progress is only possible if pressure is put on Russia. We have to understand that Putin is not stopping, and the Putin army is not ceasing its attempts to keep advancing, to achieve successes, to terrorize the civilian population, and, well, let's put it this way, by continuing the war, by continuing the pressure, by using forceful scenarios and options, they are trying to improve their own position at the negotiating table. Well, that's logical. And in order for Putin to stop this, he either needs to make some concessions, that's one option, or on the contrary, he needs to be intimidated, well, by a powerful sanctions package 500% against the countries that buy Russian oil, gas, and uranium. For example, Senator Blumenthal noted that next week the United States is set to begin considering the relevant bill in the Senate. That's why large-scale arms supplies and special operations, like the brilliant one carried out by the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, are so important. On May 30th, two powerful explosions occurred in the Russian city of Vladivostok near Desantnaya Bay. According to sources from Ukrainska Pravda, this was the result of a successful special operation by the main intelligence directorate. It is known that at least two explosions took place in the area where the 47th Separate Air Assault Battalion of the 155th Marine Brigade is stationed. One occurred near the checkpoint and the other near the location of the unit's personnel and command. Personnel, military equipment, and special equipment were hit. Locals report that at least 10 ambulances arrived at the scene. Here's another example. The next example I'll read out is about how Putin should be contained, what kind of help Ukraine needs, and how to force him to agree to meetings and negotiations. For instance, here's some more important and positive information. The Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Alexander Syrsky, reported that in May, drones of various types struck and destroyed 89,000 enemy targets. Currently, the number of drone system crews continues to increase, and drone units are being further developed. The systematic work and scaling up of drone system units are yielding real results. In May, with the help of drones of various types, more than 89,000 enemy targets were struck and destroyed, Syrsky noted. These figures are truly impressive. They are very significant. These are the ways to put pressure on Russia. This means either concessions or actions like these, but for that we need consolidation, a unified stance and support from the West. Is the West ready to provide everything in this regard right now? That's the question, although work is being done on it. Well, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, again returning to Turkey's Fidan, he made a number of statements, quite a few, so it's worth focusing attention on them. At a press conference in Kyiv on Friday, after meeting with Ukraine's Foreign Minister Sybiha, he stated that Russia's war against Ukraine is approaching a turning point. We are approaching a turning point in the war. As was noted at the start of the talks that took place in Istanbul on May 16th, we have two paths before us. Either we turn a blind eye to the continuation of this war, or we achieve a lasting peace within this year. That is, within this year, this can be interpreted as until the end of 2025, or it can be understood, as Zelensky mentioned, as until June 2026. There are different ways to interpret this, but it's worth paying attention to such details. Within this year, well, we understand that even if a meeting is being prepared between Trump, Zelensky, Putin, and Erdogan, it will still, let's say, require time. Meanwhile, the pressure on Trump is increasing in the US and in the West regarding the need for stronger and more decisive actions against Russia. French President Macron has called on US President Trump to impose sanctions against Russia if it becomes clear that the Kremlin is not committed to achieving peace. Well, apparently this refers to the fact that after those 2 weeks, the first week of the ultimatum that Trump gave to Putin is already coming to an end. And in fact, Trump in turn says that both Zelensky and Putin are being stubborn. Well, that's how it is, actually. Meanwhile, the American magazine The Atlantic reports that Trump is starting to feel humiliated by Putin, but still wants a deal with Russia. US President Trump felt humiliated because the Russian dictator Putin does not want to stop the war and refuses to agree to a ceasefire. This is reported by The Atlantic, citing sources close to Trump. The authors note, The Atlantic, these are the people who, the Signalgate scandal, do you remember? In other words, these are the people who, in the end, made it so that Waltz resigned, Trump's former national security advisor. So they are well informed. Whatever signal chats they might have read this in, I think it's real. So the authors describe Trump's relationship with Putin as one of the longest lasting and most significant geopolitical romances in recent years, which continues to exist despite accusations of interference in American elections, the special prosecutor's investigation against Trump, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That is, however, Trump is now irritated by Putin's unwillingness to sign the agreement. Meanwhile, The Hill writes about how Trump is displaying the most humiliating submission of a US president to a foreign adversary, Russia. Putin is using Trump as a puppet. While America was observing Memorial Day on May 26th, Russia carried out the largest missile and drone attack on Kyiv and other cities in over 3 years of full-scale war. Bloomberg published a headline stating that Putin wants to restore Russia as an empire, so he will continue attempts to subjugate the former Soviet republics, as well as to undermine NATO. Well, and Senators Lindsey Graham, Blumenthal, and others are starting to talk about moving forward with considering a sanctions package against Russia. In other words, the pressure on Trump will increase and it will become even stronger. But despite the sanctions, as the BBC writes, Russia has received 883 billion euros in revenue from oil and gas sales during the entire period of the full-scale invasion, including 228 billion from EU countries. In addition, Russian gas continues to be supplied to Europe through Turkey in ever-increasing volumes. In January and February, these supplies increased by 27%. Hungary and Slovakia continue to receive Russian pipeline gas. If we compare with 2023, oil revenues in 2024 have fallen by only 4%. So what's the conclusion? Hellish sanctions, attacks on Russian facilities, consolidation of the West, and an end to the policy of double standards. Only this kind of pressure can stop Putin. And will his meeting with Zelensky and Trump happen anytime soon? We'll see. For now, it all looks doubtful. Take care of yourselves and glory to Ukraine.